The morning began like any other on Maple Street, but something unseen moved beneath the ordinary sounds of the house, as if the day itself was holding its breath. Daniel Carter stood in the kitchen while the coffee machine hummed, staring through the window at a sky just turning pale blue, his reflection faint in the glass, his face older than he remembered. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock, and that quiet felt heavy, stretched thin by years of unspoken words. Laura moved behind him, opening cabinets, setting plates on the table with calm, practiced motions, her wedding ring catching the light for a second before her hand moved on. She looked composed, almost peaceful, but there was a distance in her eyes, like someone standing on the shore watching a ship that had already begun to drift away. Emily sat at the table scrolling through her phone, pretending not to notice how little her parents spoke, but she noticed everything. She noticed how her father didn't tease her about being late for school, how her mother didn't remind him about his jacket, how the space between them at the table felt wider than the table itself. Daniel picked up his mug, then set it down untouched, his jaw tightening as if he were holding back words that refused to line up properly. He had been holding them back for years. The walls around him felt smaller than they used to, filled with echoes of laughter from a time when love had been easy and future plans were spoken out loud. Back then, Laura's smile had been bright and unguarded, and Daniel had believed that staying meant loving, no matter how quiet the heart became. But this morning, the silence pressed in on him harder than ever, and for the first time, he felt afraid of how long he had been living without saying what was true. Laura asked a simple question about his schedule, and he answered politely, too politely, like a man speaking to a coworker instead of a wife. Emily looked up at him, sensing something wrong, her chest tightening without knowing why. Daniel reached for his keys, paused, and almost turned back, almost said something that might have broken the careful balance of the room, but the fear won. He kissed Laura on the cheek, a soft, distant gesture that carried habit more than feeling, and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, Laura leaned against the counter for a moment longer than necessary, her breath catching just slightly before she straightened again, unwilling to admit what her heart already knew. Outside, Daniel sat in his car with his hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine, feeling the weight of years settle on his shoulders. He thought about the man he used to be, the promises he had made, the way life had slowly turned into a routine he followed instead of a story he lived. He told himself he was being dramatic, that all marriages faded into something quieter, but deep inside, another voice whispered that quiet should not feel this empty. As he finally drove away, Emily watched from the window, her reflection blending with his car as it disappeared down the street. She felt an ache she couldn't name, like the moment before a storm when the air changes and everything goes still. She didn't know it yet, but this ordinary morning, filled with small pauses and missed words, was the beginning of a turning point, the last calm moment before her father made a choice that would reshape their family forever. Daniel did not drive home after work that evening, and the decision surprised even him, because it felt less like a choice and more like gravity pulling him somewhere he had already been leaning toward for weeks. The sun was low, painting the streets in golden shadow, as he passed familiar turns without slowing, his mind crowded with thoughts he had kept locked away for years. He told himself he only needed air, a moment to think, but his hands turned the wheel toward the river without hesitation. He parked near a small bookstore tucked between a cafe and a dry cleaner, a quiet place most people passed without noticing, and for a long moment he stayed in the car, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, his heart beating faster than it should. Inside the store, the lights were warm and gentle, and the smell of paper and coffee wrapped around him as soon as he stepped in, easing a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Anna Mitchell stood behind the counter, her hair pulled back loosely, a soft focus in her eyes as she read a page before looking up and smiling in a way that felt genuine, not polite. Daniel had met her by chance weeks earlier, during a rushed lunch break when he needed a quiet place to sit, and since then, their conversations had become something he quietly looked forward to, though he never admitted that to himself. Anna never pried, never asked about his marriage, but she listened in a way that made him feel seen, as if his words mattered simply because they were his. That evening, their talk moved easily from books to life, from favorite stories to the strange feeling of waking up one day and realizing the life you built no longer fits the person you've become. Daniel found himself speaking honestly, not complaining, not blaming, just admitting how tired he felt inside his own routine. Anna nodded, understanding without judgment, her presence calm and steady, offering comfort without promises. There was no crossing of lines, no dramatic moment, just a shared silence that felt deeper than anything Daniel had felt in years. When he finally checked the time, hours had passed unnoticed, and a sharp wave of guilt hit him, not because he had done something wrong, but because he knew he had felt something right. Outside, the air was cool, the river reflecting city lights like broken stars, and Daniel stood there, breathing deeply, realizing that his heart had already moved ahead of his life. He thought of Laura, of their quiet house, of Emily doing homework at the kitchen table, and the thought hurt more than he expected. He understood then that the real danger was not this bookstore or this woman, but the lie he had been living by staying silent, by choosing comfort over truth. Sitting in his car, Daniel rested his forehead against the steering wheel, torn between fear and relief, knowing that going home meant facing everything he had avoided, but also knowing that turning back now would only delay an ending that had already begun. He didn't want to run away, didn't want to hurt anyone, yet he finally accepted that honesty often hurts before it heals. As he started the engine and pulled onto the road toward home, his chest felt heavy but clear, as if a storm had broken inside him, washing away excuses and leaving only what was real. He didn't know how the night would unfold or how much pain his words might cause, but he knew one thing with painful certainty: the man who left the house that morning was not the same man driving back now, because somewhere between the quiet aisles of a bookstore and the glow of river lights, Daniel had realized that choosing truth, no matter the cost, was the only way forward. Daniel entered the house with a calm that felt strange even to him, setting his keys down carefully as if loud sounds might break the moment, and Laura looked up from the sofa, sensing immediately that this was not an ordinary evening. The television was on but muted, filling the room with moving light and no sound, and for a few seconds they only looked at each other, years of shared life passing silently between them. Daniel sat across from her, his back straight, his hands folded, and spoke her name in a way that made her heart tighten because she knew that tone, the one used only when something important could no longer wait. He did not rush, did not accuse, did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke slowly, choosing honesty over comfort, telling her that he felt lost inside himself, that he had been pretending to be fine when he was not, that the distance between them had grown so wide he no longer knew how to cross it without truth. Laura listened without interrupting, her face steady. Though her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, because part of her had been waiting for this moment even as she feared it. Daniel admitted that he had met someone, not in a dramatic way, not in secret promises, but in quiet conversation that made him realize how empty he had been feeling, and he made it clear that the meeting was not the cause of their problems but the mirror that finally showed them. Laura closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the words, feeling pain but also a strange sense of relief that the silence was finally broken. Upstairs, Emily stood frozen on the steps, her backpack still on her shoulder, having come home earlier than expected, hearing every word though she wished she hadn't, her heart pounding as her childhood sense of safety cracked. Daniel said he was sorry for the hurt, for the years of distance, for not being brave sooner, and Laura surprised him by admitting her own truth, that she too had felt alone, that she had tried to hold the family together by staying quiet, believing that sacrifice was the same as love. The room felt heavy, but not angry, filled with sadness that had been building for a long time, and when Laura finally spoke again, her voice was soft but firm as she said that staying together without honesty had already changed them, that maybe this pain was the price of finally being real. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying aloud, realizing her parents were not fighting but grieving, and that made it harder. Daniel said he would leave for a while, not to run, but to give space, to think clearly, to avoid turning truth into chaos, and Laura nodded, accepting the need even though it hurt deeply. As Daniel went to pack a small bag, the house felt unfamiliar, every step echoing louder than usual, every object holding a memory that now felt fragile. Emily sat on her bed staring at the wall, tears falling freely, not from anger but from loss, from the fear that nothing would ever feel solid again. Daniel stopped outside her door, his hand hovering near the frame, knowing she had heard everything, knowing that her opinion mattered more than anyone else's, but not trusting his voice enough to speak. After a long pause, he whispered that he loved her, his voice thick with emotion, and though she did not answer, he knew she heard him. When he left the house with his bag, Laura stood by the window watching his car pull away, her chest aching but her mind clear, understanding that the marriage had not ended in that moment, but had changed shape, becoming something honest at last. Upstairs, Emily curled into herself, feeling older than her years, trying to understand how love could exist alongside pain, how adults could make choices that hurt without meaning harm. That night, the house was quieter than ever before, not because something had ended, but because everything had finally been said, and in that heavy silence, each of them began to face a new reality they could not yet name, knowing only that life would never return to what it was, and that the truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. Time moved forward quietly after Daniel left, not in dramatic leaps but in small, steady steps that slowly reshaped everyone involved, and the days that followed felt strange, like learning to walk through a familiar room in the dark. Laura adjusted first, filling her time with work, long walks, and moments of reflection that allowed her to hear her own thoughts again, and though the sadness came in waves, it no longer felt like she was drowning in it. Emily watched her mother closely, noticing how she laughed more freely with friends, how she began cooking meals just for herself instead of for routine, and how strength slowly replaced shock, teaching Emily that healing did not always look loud or obvious. Daniel stayed in a modest apartment across town, keeping his distance not out of guilt but out of respect, and he spent long evenings thinking about the kind of man and father he wanted to be, realizing that honesty was not a single act but a responsibility he had to live with every day. His connection with Anna remained careful and patient, built on conversation and trust rather than urgency, and Anna never pushed for more than he could give, understanding that real care required time. Weeks later, Daniel asked Emily to meet him at a small neighborhood diner they used to visit when she was younger, and she agreed with hesitation, her emotions still tangled but her curiosity stronger than her fear. They sat across from each other in a booth by the window, the smell of coffee in the air, and for a moment neither spoke, both unsure where to begin. Daniel finally apologized, not for telling the truth, but for the pain it caused and for not realizing sooner how his silence affected her, and Emily listened carefully, her eyes steady, her heart softening as she recognized the sincerity in his voice. She admitted she was still hurt, still confused, but she didn't feel angry, because she could see that her parents were no longer pretending, and that honesty, even when painful, felt more respectful than lies. Daniel reached across the table, waiting for permission, and when Emily placed her hand in his, something inside them both eased. As months passed, the family found a new rhythm, one that did not erase the past but built gently around it, with shared dinners that were different but still warm, conversations that were more open, and moments of laughter that felt earned. Laura and Daniel learned to speak kindly to each other without expectation, recognizing that love could change without disappearing, and Emily grew into a deeper understanding of relationships, learning that real commitment meant choosing truth even when it hurt. Years later, Emily would look back on that season of her life not as the moment her family broke apart, but as the moment it became real, when her father made a choice that altered their path but also taught her the value of courage and honesty. She understood then that forever did not always mean staying together, but it could mean respecting one another enough to live truthfully, and in that understanding, she found peace, knowing that the choice her father made, though painful, allowed each of them to grow into who they were meant to be.